Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at Limex taking a look at an FFV-890C. This is a Swedish trials version of the Israeli Galil, and it takes us back to the 1970s. This is part of the program when Sweden was looking to replace its existing AK-4 rifles. That was a Swedish production licensed copy of the G3. Well, they wanted to replace them with something in 5.56. This is clearly the going trend. Made a lot of sense anyway. And so in the mid-late 1970s, the Swedes tested basically every 5.56 rifle that was available out there. They tested the HK-33. They tested the FNs, both the Cal and the FNC. They tested the AR-18. They tested the Stoner 63, the M16, the Beretta AR-70, what am I missing? The SIG 540, and two different versions of the Galil. There was a Swedish company named FFV, which I'm not even going to try and pronounce, it's that essentially worked with IMI to license the Galil for Swedish testing. Obviously, it had to go through a Swedish company, and if it were chosen, it was going to be manufactured domestically in Sweden. So they submitted both a Galil ARM, that's the full-length version, and also a Galil SAR, that's the short version, which is basically this. During the initial testing, a lot of this was, of course, Arctic winter testing, because this is Sweden we're talking about. Virtually every gun in the trials fell out, and there were only two survivors. The Galil ARM, I think, actually worked okay, but the Swedes didn't want the full size, they preferred the short one. So the Galil SAR, aka the FFV-890, made it into the final serious set of trials, and the FNC made it into the final trials. And that would it would take a couple of years doing testing back and forth on the two guns in different conditions, and they actually made a number of improvements to the Galil during that time, which resulted in the model we have here, the FFV-890C. C indicates like an improved version. It's a Swedish equivalent to like A1. So let's go ahead, let me show you what they've changed on this improved version that makes it different than just a stock Galil SAR, and then we'll talk about why this isn't the current standard Swedish service rifle. So the initial FFV-890s were essentially just stock Galil SARs. It is with the 890C that they start making some changes. So first, most obvious change is they went ahead and painted it green. You'll find that eventually with the adopted AK-5s, also all painted green. The Swedes like that green. Magazines, by the way, are just standard Galil mags. 35 round capacity is typical. This isn't a trials mag, it's just a generic Galil magazine. The 890C has a 330 millimeter or 13-inch long barrel. One of the changes to the C pattern was actually to shorten the gas tube and the gas piston, move the gas port back a bit, move the front sight block back a bit, and give it a shorter and now single-piece handguard. So I don't think there's actually any way to remove the handguard short of taking out the pins here and removing the gas block. The selector markings were changed to SAP, which is just safe, semi, and automatic in Swedish. It's interesting, they added this sort of blocking tab to shorten up the ejection port. I presume that's just to limit the space for potential ingress of dirt. The whole system here was originally developed around 7.62x39. The Israelis didn't mess with this on the Galil, but it seems like perhaps the Swedes decided to shorten it up because they could. They went to a vertical bolt handle. The trigger guard was enlarged a bit here. The magazine release is enlarged a little bit, and more substantially, the magazine release guard, which on the original Galil comes down here and prevents accidental removal of the magazine, that guard was disposed of. And I suspect that is for shooting with gloves on, where it's hard to get in around that guard if you've got gloves or mittens and you do want easier access to it to reload. You can see we have SAP selector markings here on the thumb selector. Like the Galil, this does have the left side thumb selector so that you can operate it with your shooting hand. We have only two markings here, FFV-890C on the side of the receiver and a serial number 0794. These parts were basically all made by IMI in Israel, or IWI. The receivers have these optics rail cutouts that are typical, distinctive Israeli Galil elements, but were never actually used in the Swedish trials. This was originally set up to fit night optics. The sights are very much standard Galil sights, so you've got a 2-position aperture. You can also set it in the middle for night shooting. You can flip up the luminous rear night sight. That goes along, well, the luminous rear night sight goes along with your flip up luminous front sight, or when not in use, you have a nice thin round post there. Folding stock off the Galil, of course. Then we can pop the top cover off here. And this little rubber gasket was added. One of the formal complaints with the rifle, which seems a little goofy to me, not something I've ever actually encountered in AKs or Galils, but one of the complaints was that oil could spit back out of the notch for the spring guide, this thing right here. Spit oil back into the shooter's face. So they tried to get around that issue by adding this rubber gasket on the inside. It's really not so much a buffer for recoil as it is just a gasket. Recoil buffer would have been in front of, be out there. So that didn't work ultimately. I guess that's a spoiler. They did not ultimately adopt this rifle. Do just a little bit more disassembly since we're in here already. We can pull out the bolt and carrier. It's got a nice short little gas piston on it. And then this disassembles just like the Galil, because it is a Galil, so gas tube pulls out the back there, and this is a bit shorter than a standard Galil SAR gas tube. Handguards, green plastic, they do have a metal insulating shield in there, but I don't believe these come off without actually moving the gas port, the gas block, front sight block forward. And lastly, of course, this has a standard Galil pattern folding stock. In addition to painting the gun green, they went ahead and made a green plastic tube for the top so that the shooter's face isn't on metal. That's relevant in the hot desert in Israel. It's also relevant in the cold Arctic in Sweden. So after this pattern, there was actually a final second improved variation of the FFV-890 that was made. And it's kind of weird. Some of the features actually reverted back to the Galil. They brought back the magazine release protector. They changed the rear sight to something kind of like an M249 saw. But it seems like the fix was pretty much in. This was a predetermined contest, at least by the time you get to about 1979 or 1980. From what I've read, from what I've heard, the 890 here actually performed better than the FNC in most of the trials, but the reports were phrased in different ways or sanitized to the point that the FNC came out looking like the better gun. And ultimately, in 1980, the Swedish military chose the FNC and then spent the next several years modifying and improving and tweaking it before eventually adopting it as the AK-5 in 1985. Now, as to why this decision was made, why this intrigue around these two guns, obviously it's not fully clear. That's why they call it intrigue, but it seems there are two major possibilities. One of them is the Swedish government at the time was not particularly enthusiastic about Israel or about licensing an Israeli rifle to use. This comes fairly shortly on the heels of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Israel had occupied a bit of territory that had not previously been Israeli, and the Swedish government wasn't very happy about that. There was also a potential feeling that really the only obvious enemy that these rifles were going to be used against was the Soviet Union, and it wasn't really politically viable to adopt what could be seen as a variant of the Soviet Union's standard rifle. They didn't want a Kalashnikov for political reasons, kind of the opposite of Finland, who specifically went towards the Kalashnikov for political reasons. But There's then also, and that's an understandable, if not strictly technical consideration. And then there's also the consideration that the FNC used a fair amount of stamping in its construction. This is a rifle that was going to be manufactured in Sweden, whatever was chosen. Sweden was currently set up to make the stamped HKG3, and they anticipated that it would be a lot more cost effective to make an FNC than to make a milled receiver Galil like this. There have been some experiments with stamped receiver Galils, but they've never really worked. Not very effectively. And that wasn't in the cards for Sweden. So this was a more expensive rifle than the FNC to begin with, and when you layer on top of that the machine tooling that was already in place for manufacture in Sweden, that is also a potentially understandable rationale, if not one that, do you really want to be doctoring test reports to justify an economic decision? Anyway, that's politics, and of course ultimately the FNC gets adopted as the AK-5. It appears that somewhere just shy of 1,000 FFV-890s were manufactured. These were being tested and evaluated for something like 4 or 5 years, and they made a number of significant troop trials, batches of them. Some of these actually are still in use with Swedish police agencies. A few of them have gotten out onto the civilian collector market. I know of a couple in private collections around the world. Ultimately, FFV sold the rights to this system, to this design, to Valmet. It's not entirely clear to me exactly what was available for sale, because there's not a whole lot different here from the Valmet. Actually, scratch that. Valmet did make use of this. This was briefly tested in what would eventually become the RK95 project, which was in the mid-late 80s, which kind of fits. This might well have been what Valmet got out of the FFV-890. Anyway, they didn't release any versions of this sort of rifle. So that's ultimately where it went. And Sweden ended up with the AK-5. Anyway, big thanks to Limex for giving me access to this FFV-890C to take apart and show to you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.